Irving Stone's The Agony and the Ecstasy. Book 2. The Sculpture Garden. He was drawn to the garden on the Piazza San Marco, as though the ancient stone statues had magnets buried within them. Sometimes he did not know that his feet were carrying him there. He would find himself inside the gate, lurking in the shadow of the loggia. He did not speak to anyone, did not venture down the path through the meadow to the casino where Bertoldo and the apprentices were working. He just stood motionless, a hunger in his eyes. Thrashing deep into the night, as his brothers lay sleeping around him, he thought, there must be some way Lorenzo de' Medici's sister Nannina is married to Bernardo Rucellai. If I went to him, told him I was Francesca's son, asked him to speak to Il Magnifico for me, but a Buonarroti could not go to a Rucellai. Hat in hand, Ghirlandaio was patient. We must finish the baptism panel in a matter of weeks and pull our scaffolding down to the lower panel. Zacharias writing the name of his son. Time is growing short now. Suppose you start drawing instead of running the streets. May I bring a model for the neophyte? I saw one in the old market, unloading his cart. Agreed. The boy sketched his rough-hewn young contadino, just in from the fields, naked except for his braccia, kneeling to take off his clodhoppers, the flesh tones a sunburned amber, the figure clumsy with graceless bumpkin muscles, but the face transfused with light as the young lad gazed up at John. Behind him he did 2 white-bearded assistants to John, with beauty in their faces and a rugged power in their figures. Granacci hovered over him uneasily as the figures emerged. Ghirlandaio is incapable of drawing such figures. Bandaged toes, eh? Ghirlandaio was too swamped in designing the remaining half-dozen panels to interfere. This time when Michelangelo mounted the scaffold, he no longer felt timorous before the wet plaster. He experimented with flesh tones from his paint pots, enjoyed this culminating physical effort of bringing his figures to life, clothing them in warm-colored lemon yellow and rose robes. Yet always, at the back of his mind, he was crying. 2 whole years! How will I endure it? Ghirlandaio was working him hard. We'll move you over to the other side of the choir now, for the Adoration of the Magi. Prepare the cartoon for the last 2 standing figures here on the right. The Adoration cartoon was already so crowded with figures that he derived little pleasure from adding 2 more. Returning from dinner, Granacci announced to the apprentices, table. It's just a year ago today that Michelangelo started. I've ordered a damigiana of wine, brought in at sundown. We'll have a celebration. Silence greeted him. The studio was crackling with tension. At the center of the table, the apprentices had their heads down over their work. Ghirlandaio was sitting at his desk as rigid as one of his master mosaics, his scowl blacker than the base of his beard. Il Magnifico has summoned me and asked if I would like to send my 2 best apprentices to his new Medici school, he declared. Michelangelo stood riveted to the planks of the studio floor. No, "I would not like to send my two best apprentices," cried Ghirlandaio, "to have my bottego raided, and certainly not on the day that Benedetto is invited to Paris to paint for the King of France. I have half a dozen panels to complete." He glared down at the assemblage. "But who dares say no to Il Magnifico? You, Buonarroti, you would like to go?" "I have been hanging around that garden like a starved dog in front of a butcher's stall," pleaded Michelangelo. "Basta! Enough!" It was the angriest Michelangelo had ever seen him. "Granacci, you and Buonarroti are released from your apprenticeship. I'll sign the papers at the guild this evening. Now back to work, all of you. Do you think I am Ghirlandaio, Il Magnifico, with millions to support an academy?" Joy drenched Michelangelo to the skin like a tramontana rain. Granacci stood glum. "Granacci, caro mio, what is it?" "I like paint. I can't work with stone. It's too hard." "No, no, my friend. You will be a fine sculptor. I will help you. Just wait and see." Granacci achieved a wistful smile. "Oh, I will come with you, Michelangelo. But whatever will I do with a hammer and chisel? I'll cut myself out at the knees." Michelangelo could not concentrate. After a little time, he left the big table and went to Ghirlandaio's desk. He wanted to thank the man who only a year ago had taken him in, but he stood below the desk, stars in his eyes and silence in his mouth. How do you express gratitude to a man for letting you abandon him? Ghirlandaio saw the conflict on the boy's face. When he spoke, it was softly, so no one else might hear. "You were right, Buonarroti. Fresco is not your trade. That neophyte you did for me looks as though it were carved out of rock. You have a talent as a draftsman. With years of training, perhaps, you can transfer it to stone. But never forget that Domenico Ghirlandaio was your first master." In front of the Buonarroti house that evening, Michelangelo muttered to Granacci, "You'd better come in with me. With two of us in the same sack, he's not so likely to drop it off the Ponte Vecchio." They climbed the main stairway to avoid the kitchen, and Michelangelo's stepmother went quietly into the family room where his father sat hunched over the angular corner desk. Dwarfed by the 14-foot ceiling, the room was cold. It took the Florentine sun the better part of spring to permeate the stone. "Father, there is news. I am leaving Ghirlandaio's." "Ah, splendid! I knew you would come to your senses. You will join the Wool Guild." "I'm leaving to become a student at the Medici Sculpture Garden." Lodovico was caught between joy and befuddlement. "Medici Garden? What garden?" "I'm going too, Messer Buonarroti," added Granacci. "We are to be apprenticed to Bertoldo under the guidance of Il Magnifico." "A stone cutter?" Ludovico threw anguished arms ceilingward. "To be a sculptor, father. Bertoldo is the last master left." "One never knows the end of a piece of bad luck. It has more turns than a snake. If your mother hadn't been thrown from her horse, you would not have been sent to the Topolino's to nurse. You would have known nothing of stone cutting." Michelangelo did not risk an answer. Granacci spoke. "Messer Buonarroti, a dozen other children might have been placed with the Topolinos and never got stone dust in their lungs. Your son has an affinity for sculpture." What is a sculptor? Lower than a painter. Not even a member of the 12 guilds. A laborer, like a wood chopper, or an olive picker. With one big difference, Granacci persisted courteously. The olives are pressed for oil, the wood is burned. Cooking soup. Both are consumed. Art has a magic quality. The more minds that digest it, the longer it lives. Poetry! Screamed Ludovico. I'm talking hard common sense to save the life of my family, and you recite poetry? Tell your father that Lorenzo, Il Magnifico, is offering Michelangelo. He is the richest man in Italy, and known to be generous. How long is the apprenticeship? How large the wage? I don't know. I didn't ask. You didn't ask, sneered Ludovico. Do you think we have the wealth of the Granacci, that we can support you in your follies? A flush mottled Francesco Granacci's blond cheeks. He spoke with unaccustomed bluntness. I asked. Nothing is promised. No contract, no pay, just free instruction. Michelangelo shifted his legs and torso to receive Ludovico's culminating burst of rage. Instead, Ludovico collapsed onto a hard leather chair with a heavy plop, tears coming to his eyes. Detachedly, Michelangelo thought, It's funny about us Florentines. Not one drop of our blood is salted with sentiment. Yet we cry so easily. He went to his father's side, put a hand on his shoulder. Father, give me a chance. Lorenzo de' Medici wants to create a new generation of sculptors for Florence. I want to become one of them. Ludovico looked up at his most promising son. Lorenzo has asked specifically for you? Because he thinks you have talent? The boy thought how much easier it would be for everyone if he could tell a few simple lies. Lorenzo asked Ghirlandaio for his first 2 best apprentices. Granacci and I were chosen. His stepmother had been listening at the kitchen door. She came into the room. Her face was pale, the dark side hairs standing out in stark relief. To Michelangelo, she said, I have nothing against you, Michelangelo. You are a good boy. You eat well. She turned to Ludovico. But I must speak for my people. My father thought it would be an honor for us to be connected with the Buonarroti. What do I have left if you let this boy destroy our position? Ludovico gripped the sides of his chair. He looked weary. I will never give my consent. Then he walked out of the room, taking his wife and mother with him. In a lacerated silence, Granacci said, He's only trying to do his duty by you. How can he conceive that a 14-year-old's judgment is better than his? It's asking too much. Should I lose my opportunity? Flared Michelangelo angrily. No. But remember, he's doing the best he can, with the bull-headed son forcing him into a situation which he has not, forgive me, the intellect to understand. Michelangelo blinked in silence. You love your father, don't you, Granacci? Yes. I envy you. Then you should be kind to your father. Kind? Yes. Since you have no intention of being hurt by him. Two. The Medici sculpture garden was unlike Ghirlandaio's bottega. It did not have to earn its living. Domenico Ghirlandaio was already always rushed, not only to earn money for a large family, but because he signed so many contracts with completion dates. Nothing could be further from pressure than the atmosphere into which Michelangelo stepped on the warm April day when he began his apprenticeship to Lorenzo the Magnificent and Bertoldo. The feel of the garden was, "Take your time. Don't make haste. We have only one mission here, to learn. We have nothing to sell but training, nothing to push to completion but your own skill and artistry. You have only to grow. Calma. Prepare yourself for a lifetime of sculpturing." The first person to greet him was Pietro Torrigiani, a powerfully built, blonde, green-eyed beauty. He said with a flashing white-toothed smile, "So you're the lurker, the ghost of the garden. You haunted these porticos." "I didn't think you noticed me." "Noticed?" replied Torrigiani. "We were devoured by your eyes." Bertoldo loved only two things, as well as sculpture: laughter and cooking. His humor had in it more spice than his chicken alla cacciatora. He had written a cookbook, and his one complaint at having moved into the Medici palace was that he had no chance to celebrate his recipes. But sculpture he could and did celebrate, for this frail person with the snow-white hair, red-cheeked face, and pale blue eyes was the inheritor of all the communicable knowledge of the golden age of Tuscan sculpture. He linked his thin arms through those of the new apprentices. "True, not all skill is communicable," he explained. "Donatello made me his heir, but he could never make me his peer. He poured his experience and craftsmanship into me the way molten bronze is poured into a cast. No man can do more. Without Donato, I would have been a maker of gold jewelry. After more than half a century with him, I remained only his miniaturist." Try as he would, he couldn't put his finger on my fist, nor his passion in my bowels. We all are as God made us. I will show you everything Ghiberti taught Donatello, and Donatello taught me. How much you absorb depends on your capacity. A teacher is like a cook. Give him a stringy chicken or a tough piece of veal, and not even his most delicious sauce can make it tender. Michelangelo laughed out loud. Bertoldo, pleased with his own humor, turned them toward the casino. "And now to work. If you have any talent, it will come out," Michelangelo thought. "Just let them put a hammer and subia in my hands, and they will see the chips fly." Bertoldo had no intention of putting those tools into the hands of a beginner. He assigned Michelangelo a drawing desk on the portico between 17-year-old Torrigiani and 29-year-old Andrea Sansovino, who had been apprenticed to Antonio Pulajuelo, and whose commissioned work was to be seen in Santo Spirito. Supplying him with materials from the inner rooms, Bertoldo said, "Drawing is a different medium for the sculptor. A man and a block of stone are three-dimensional, which immediately gives them more in common than a man and a wall or a panel of wood to be painted." Michelangelo found the apprentices in the garden akin to those at Ghirlandaio's. Sansovino was the counterpart of Minardi, already a professional artist who had earned his living for years at terracotta, with Minardi's sweet disposition giving generously of his time and patience to the beginners. At the other end of the scale was Soji, a 14-year-old like Cieco, who had stumbled into sculpture and to Michelangelo's rigorous eye was totally without talent. And there was the inevitable Jacopo, in this case 20-year-old Bazio de Montelupo, as thoughtless as a wren, and like Jacopo, an amoral carnal Tuscan who scavenged each night's scandal for the morning's tall tale. On Michelangelo's first morning of work, Baccio burst in late with the day's most exciting news. A monster had been born in Venice, with one eye behind each ear. In neighboring Padua, another monster had been born, with 2 heads and 2 hands for each arm. The next morning he told of the Florentine who consorted with bad females, so as to save as much as possible his wife's virtue. He was particularly good with contadini humor. He told of the patrician Florentine lady, elaborately gowned in silk and pearls, who asked a peasant coming out of Santo Spirito, "Is the Mass for the villani ill-bred over?" "Yes, madame," replied the peasant, "and the Mass for the puttani whores is about to begin, so hurry." Bertoldo clapped his hands in delight. The counterpart of Granacci was Rusticci, 15-year-old son of a wealthy Tuscan nobleman, who worked for his own pleasure and the honor of creating art. Lorenzo had wanted Rusticci to live in the Medici palace, but the young man preferred to stay by himself in rooms in the Via de' Martelli. Michelangelo had been at the garden only a week when Rusticci invited him to dinner. Like Bertoldo, I enjoy the homely details of cooking. I'll put a goose in the oven to bake in the morning. Michelangelo found Rusticci rustic, living up to his name, for the apartment was filled with animals: 3 dogs, an eagle chained to a perch, a mynah bird trained by the contadini of his father's estate, who kept screeching, "Va al inferno!" Go to hell. Even more distracting was the porcupine Rusticci had trained to be a pet, who moved restlessly under the dinner table, pricking Michelangelo's legs with his quills. After dinner they entered a quiet room with family paintings on the walls. Against this aristocratic background the rustic became the cultured young man. "You can draw, Michelangelo. From this, perhaps, you will evolve into a sculptor. Then let me warn you, do not go to live in the luxuriousness of the palace." Michelangelo gave a repudiatory snort. "Little danger of that. Listen, my friend. It's pleasant to get used to the expensive, the soft, the comfortable. Once you're addicted, it's so easy to become a sycophant, to trim the sails of your judgment in order to be kept on. The next step is to change your work to please those in power, and that is death to the sculptor." "I'm plain, Rusticci." The apprentice to whom he became closest was Torrigiani, who looked to Michelangelo more like a soldier than a sculptor. Torrigiani fascinated Michelangelo. He also terrified him when he knitted his brows and spoke in his deeply resonant voice. Torrigiani came from an ancient family of wine merchants, long since noble, and was the most audacious of the apprentices in handling Bertoldo. He could also be quarrelsome, having alienated several of his fellow apprentices. He gave Michelangelo a quick, warm friendship, talking to him constantly from the adjoining work table. Michelangelo had never known anyone as handsome as Torrigiani. This kind of physical beauty, almost of human perfection, left him weak in the face of his own lack of fine features and smallness of stature. Granacci watched the relationship with Torrigiani grow. To Michelangelo's question whether Granacci did not think Torrigiani magnificent, Granacci replied guardedly, "I have known him all my life. Our families are associated." "You haven't answered my question, Granacci." "Before you make a friend, eat a peck of salt with him." He had been in the garden for a week when Lorenzo de' Medici entered with a young girl. Michelangelo now saw close up for the first time the man who, without office or rank, ruled Florence and had made her a mighty republic, wealthy not only in trade, but in art, literature, scholarship. Lorenzo de' Medici, 40 years old, had a rough-hewn face that appeared to have been carved out of dark mountain rock. It was an irregular countenance, not at all handsome, with muddy skin, a jutting jaw, lower lip which protruded beyond the upper, a turned-up nose, the up-tilting end of which bulked larger than the bony bridge, large dark eyes, cheeks showing dark hollows beyond the corners of the mouth, and a mass of dark hair parted in the center, then combed down to the middle of each eyebrow. He was dressed in a long sienna-colored robe with purple sleeves, the tip of a white collar showing at the neck. He was just over medium height, with a sturdy physique, which he kept in condition by days of hard riding and hawking. He was also a trained classical student, an omnivorous reader of Greek and Latin manuscripts, a poet whom the Plato Academy likened to Petrarch, and Dante, the builder of Europe's first public library, for which he had assembled 10,000 manuscripts and books, the largest collection since Alexandria. He was acknowledged to be the greatest patron of literature and art that any prince has ever been, with a collection of sculptures, paintings, drawings, carved gems, open to all artists and students for study and inspiration. For the scholars who had gathered in Florence to make it the scholastic heart of Europe, he had provided villas on the slope of Fiesole, where Pico dello Mirandola, Angelo, Poliziano, Marsilio, Ficino, and Cristoforo Landino translated newly found Greek and Hebraic manuscripts, wrote poetry, philosophic and religious books, helped create what Lorenzo called the revolution of humanism. Michelangelo had heard the stories about Lorenzo, the single favorite topic of the conversation in Florence, of how he had weak eyes and had been born without a sense of smell. Now, as he listened to Lorenzo speaking to Bertoldo, he realized that the voice had a harsh, unpleasing quality. Yet this would appear to be Lorenzo's only unpleasing quality, just as the weakness of his eyes was his only weakness, and the lack of a sense of smell the only lack with which he had been born. For Lorenzo, single richest man in the world, courted by rulers of the Italian states, as well as dynasties as powerful as Turkey and China, had an open, lovable nature, and a total lack of arrogance. Ruler of the Republic, in the same sense that the Gonfalonieri di Giustizia and the Signora were governors of the law and ordinance of the city. He had no army, no guard, walked the streets of Florence unattended, speaking to all citizens as true equals, living a simple family life, romping on the floor with his children, and holding open house to the artists, literary men, and scholars of the world. Therein lay his genius. He exercised absolute authority in matters of policy, yet governed Florence with such good judgment and inherent courtesy and dignity that people who might otherwise be enemies worked together harmoniously. Not even his able father, Piero, or his genius grandfather, Cosimo, called Pater Patriae, father of his country, by all Tuscany, for creating a republic out of Florence's several hundred years of bloody civil war between the opposing factions of Guelphs and Ghibellines, had obtained such happy results. Florence could sack Lorenzo il Magnifico and his palace on an hour's notice, and drive him out. He knew it. The people knew it. And this knowledge made Lorenzo's untitled governing work. For just as there was no arrogance in him, there was no cowardice. He had saved his father's life in a dashing military coup while only 17, and had risked his own life by invading the camp of Ferrante in Naples, with no more personal protection than he used on the streets of Florence to save his city from invasion. This was the man who stood just a few feet from Michelangelo, talking affectionately to Bertoldo about some antique sculptures that had just arrived from Asia Minor that day, for sculpture was as important to Lorenzo as his fleets of ships sailing the world's seas, his chains of banks throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, his millions of golden florins, worth of produce and trade each year in every commodity, from Florence's wool, oil, wine, to the exotic perfumes, flavorings, and silks of the Orient. From some, Lorenzo commanded respect because of his wealth, from others because of his power. But by the scholar and artist he was respected and loved for his passion for knowledge, for the freedom of the mind, imprisoned more than 1,000 years in dark, dank dungeons, which Lorenzo de' Medici had pledged himself to liberate. Now Lorenzo stopped to chat with the apprentices. Michelangelo turned his gaze to the girl walking beside him. She was a slight thing, younger than himself, dressed in a long-sleeved gown of rose-colored wool, a gamura with its full skirt, fallen in soft, loose pleats, and a tight-laced bodice, under which she wore a pale yellow blouse with a high rounded neck. Her slippers were of brocaded yellow, and on her thick, dark hair was a rose satin cap encrusted in pearls. She was so pale that not even the rose-colored cap and gown could throw color into her thin cheeks. As Lorenzo passed his table with an imperceptible nod, suddenly Michelangelo's eyes met those of the girl. She stopped. He stopped in his work. She stopped in her walk. He could not take his gaze from this slender, piquant-faced girl. She was startled by the ferocity of expression in his face, from the pouring of his energies into the drawing before him. Color pulsated upward in her ivory cheeks. Michelangelo felt this awakening between them in quickened breath. For a moment he thought she was going to speak to him, for she moistened her pale lips. Then with a quivering movement she removed her gaze and rejoined her father. Lorenzo put his arm about the girl's tiny waist. They strolled past the fountain, made their way to the gate, and out into the piazza. Michelangelo turned to Torrigiani. "Who was that?" "The magnificent one, you idiot!" "No, no, the girl." Girl? Oh, Contessina, his daughter. Last one left in the palace. Contessina? Little countess? Yes, Lorenzo used to call his other daughters Contessina as a nickname. When this puny one was born, he had her baptized Contessina. Why do you ask? No reason. Three. Ludovico had never given his consent to Michelangelo's entering the garden. Although the family knew that he had left the Ghirlandaio studio, they were avoiding the descent into sculpture by declining to acknowledge it. They rarely saw him. He left at dawn when all were asleep, except his stepmother, already out marketing. Come home promptly at 12 when Lucrezia brought in the roast or fowl, and worked at the garden until dark. Loitering as long as possible, on the way home to the family would be in bed, and there would be only his brother, Buonarrota, lying awake to ask the news of the day, or his grandmother waiting in the kitchen to give him a light supper. You're outgrowing your shirts, Michelangelo, Mona Alessandra said, and your stockings are shabby. Your father feels that since you chose not to earn, but no matter, I've had this money put away. Buy yourself what you need. He pecked at her leathery cheek. Theirs was the abiding love in the family, and they knew only sketchily how to communicate it. He was austere by nature, and had no desire for things. I'll be carving soon, and covered from head to foot with stone dust. No one will notice my clothes. She respected his pride, but put the few coins back in a pouch. As you will. The money is here for you. Granacci saw no need to rise so early each morning, or to return so late at night. Only at midday did the boys come and go together. Granacci was growing more depressed each day. His hunched-over shoulders seemed only an inch or two above Michelangelo's. It's that cold, clammy clay, he complained. I hate it. I try to model as badly as possible, so Bertoldo won't tell me I'm ready for carving. I've tried pietra dura, hard stone, a dozen times, and every blow of the hammer goes through me instead of the stone. But Granacci, carissimo, marble has resonance, Michelangelo pleaded. It's receptive. Pietra dura is like stale bread. Wait until you work marble. That's like sinking your fingers into fresh dough. Granacci searched his friend's features, puzzled. You're so flinty about everything, but put marble in your mouth and you're a poet. He found himself plunged into a cauldron of drawing. Almost the first sentence Bertoldo uttered to him was, Here in the garden drawing is the sine qua non. When you arrive in the morning, draw your left hand, then take off your shoes and draw your feet. It's good practice in foreshortening. How about drawing my right hand as well? Another humorist in our midst, groaned Bertoldo, with delight. Even when he had worked the Pietra Serena for the Topolinos, Michelangelo had shifted the hammer from right hand to left, feeling no difference in precision or balance. When he had drawn his left hand from a number of positions, he shifted the pen and drew his right, first grazing at his palm, then turning it over with the fingers stretched rigidly outward. Bertoldo came by, picked up the sheet with a half-dozen drawings crowding each other on the paper. "The hogshead gives the wine it contains," he murmured softly. I took no offense. My right and left, they are the same. Live models were drawn from every quarter of Florence, provided through Lorenzo. Scholars in black velvet, soldiers with bull necks, square heads and thick arching eyebrows, swashbuckling toughs, contadini off their carts, bald-headed old men with hooked noses and nutcracker chins, monks in black cloaks, black caps with their flaps turned up over their grey hair. The gay blades of Florence, handsome with Greek noses, running straight from the brow, curly hair worn low on their necks, round empty eyes, the wool dyers with stained arms, the calloused ironmongers, the burly porters, plump house servants, nobles in red and white silk hemmed with pearls, slender boys in violet, chubby children to serve as models for putti. Michelangelo grumbled at Bertoldo's harsh criticism of a torso he had drawn. "How can we draw only from the outside? All we see is what pushes against the skin. If we could follow the inside of a body, the bone, muscle, to know a man, we must know his budelli e sangue, guts and blood. Never have I seen the inside of a man." "Dio fatuto!" swore Bertoldo softly. "God is scuttled. Doctors are allowed to dissect one body on a special day of the year in front of the city council. Other than this, it is the worst crime in Florence. Put it out of your mind." "My mouth, yes. My mind, no. I'll never sculpture accurately until I can see how a human body works." Not even the Greeks dissected, and they were a pagan people without a church to forbid. Nor did Donatello need to cut into a human body for his marvelous knowledge. Do you need to be better than Phidias and Donatello? Better, no. Different, yes. Michelangelo had never seen Bertoldo so agitated. He reached a hand to the old man's thin arm, patted it quietingly. In spite of these daily shocks, they became friends. While others were modeling in clay or carving stone, Bertoldo took the boy into the casino and stood over him for hours while Michelangelo copied Egyptian amulets, Greek medallions, Roman coins, holding each precious work of art in his hand while he explained what the ancient artists had tried to achieve. To his surprise, Michelangelo also acquired the devotion of Torrigiani, who now moved his workbench closer to Michelangelo's. Torrigiani had an overwhelming personality. He swept Michelangelo off his feet with his charm, his attention, his vivacity. He was a dandy who garbed himself in colorful silk shirts and a broad belt with gold buckles. He stopped at the barber in the straw market every morning before coming to work to be shaved and have his hair combed with a perfumed oil. Michelangelo was a messy worker. He got charcoal on his hands, which he then forgetfully rubbed into his face. He spilled paint on his shirt, ink on his stockings. Torrigiani turned in a good day's work, yet managed to keep immaculate his bright yellow linen chemise, a waist-length shirt with puffed sleeves, the green tunic with a T embroidered on the shoulder in yellow silk, the dark blue jersey calzone. He had evolved a sculpturing stance, which kept the stone dust and chips out of his clothes and hair, unheard of for stone carvers who emerge at the end of the day's work looking like monoliths. He was an object of wonder to Michelangelo, who was flattered when Torrigiano put a powerful arm around his shoulders, held his handsome face close to his, and exclaimed about his latest design. "Michelangelo mio, you do the cleanest work and get dirtier doing it than anyone I know." Torrigiano was always in motion, laughing, posturing, talking good sense and nonsense, but never still, never quiet, waving his hands with their emerald and pearl rings, needing to dominate the air about him. His robust singing voice rang out over the lush spring meadow with its wildflowers, and the Scalpolini in the far corner of the garden, who were building a library to house Lorenzo's manuscripts and books, stopped for a moment to listen. When the apprentices walked in the morning to study the early sun on the Giottos in Santa Croce, or the afternoon rays on Filippino Lippi's young St. John and two saints in Santo Spirito, or to catch the sunset glow on the sculptured figures on the campanile, designed by Giotto and executed by his pupil Andrea Pisano, Torrigiano slipped his arm through Michelangelo's, wooed him, kept him a captive, though enchanted, audience. To be a soldier, Michelangelo, to fight in mortal combat, to kill the enemy with sword and lance, conquer new lands and all their women, that is the life. An artist? Bah! It is work for the Sultan's eunuchs. You and I must travel the world together. Amico mio! Find combat and danger and treasure. Michelangelo felt a deep affection for Torrigiano. A love almost. He felt himself to be simple to have won the admiration of so beautiful and desirable a youth as Torrigiani. It was heady wine to one who never drank. "4. He now had to unlearn much that he had accumulated at Ghirlandaio's studio because of the differences in drawing for fresco and for sculpture. "This is drawing for its own sake," Bertoldo cautioned him, in precisely the words Ghirlandaio had used to caution him against it, to achieve authority of eye and hand. Bertoldo drummed the differences into him. The sculptor is after three-dimensional figures, not only height and width, but depth. The painter draws to occupy space, the sculptor to displace it. The painter draws a still life within a frame. The sculptor draws to surprise movement, to discover the tensions and torsions striving within the human figure. The painter draws to reveal the particular. The sculptor draws to unearth the universal. Comprendi? Understand? He demanded. Michelangelo was silent. Most important of all, the painter draws to externalize, to wrench a shape out of himself and set it down on paper. The sculptor draws to internalize, to pull a shape out of the world and solidify it within himself. Some of this Michelangelo had sensed, but much of it he recognized as the hard wisdom of experience. "I am a stufato, a stew," apologized Bertoldo. "Everything that every sculptor in Tuscany has believed for 2 centuries has been poured into my head. You must forgive me if it leaks obiter dicta." Bertoldo, burdened with the task of rearing a new generation of sculptors, was a dedicated teacher, unlike Ghirlandaio, who simply did not have the time. Sculptors are the best monosyllabic men. The sounds of the hammer and chisel, their overlanguage, and their true speech, drowning out small voices and smaller worlds. Bertoldo was the exception. "Michelangelo, you draw well, but it is also important to know why one must draw well. Drawing is a candle that can be lighted so that the sculptor does not have to grope in the dark. A plan for understanding the structure you are gazing at. To try to understand another human being, to grapple for his ultimate depths, that is the most dangerous of human endeavors. And all this the artist essays with no weapon but a pen or charcoal. He shrugged. That romantic Torrigiani talks about going off to the wars. Child's play. There is no thrill of mortal danger to surpass that of a lone man trying to create something that never existed before. Michelangelo held his day's work in his hand, searching it as though to understand better what Bertoldo was saying, seeking to find in it some part of what Bertoldo wanted there. Drawing is the supreme way of blotting out your ignorance of a subject, the old man exhorted, establishing wisdom in its place, just as Dante did when he wrote the lines of the Purgatorio. Yes, drawing is like reading Homer, so that you will know about Priam and Helen of Troy. Suetonius, so that you may learn about the Caesars. Michelangelo lowered his head. I am ignorant. I do not read Greek or Latin. Urbino tried for 3 years to teach me, but I was stubborn. I would not learn. I wanted only to draw. Stupido! You have missed my point. No wonder Urbino had trouble teaching you. Drawing is learning. It is discipline, a measuring stick with which to see if there is honesty in you. It's a confessional. It will reveal everything about you while you imagine you are revealing someone else. Drawing is the poet's written line, set down to see if there be a story worth telling, a truth worth revealing. The old man's voice became soft, affectionate. Remember this. Figlio mio, to draw is to be like God when he put breath into Adam. It is the other breathing of the artist, the outer breathing of the artist and the inner breathing of the model that creates a new third life on paper. The act of love, Michelangelo, the act of love through which everything on earth is born. Yes, drawing was the breath of life. He had known that. Yet for him, it was not an end, but a means. He began remaining behind at night, unknown to anyone, picking up tools and working the scraps of stone lying about, yellowish white travertines from the quarries of Rome, pietraforte from Lombrolino, conglomerate breccia from Impruneta, dark green marble from Prato, mottled reddish yellow marble from Sieno, pink marble from Gavarano, transparent Cipollino, marble blue, and white-flowered Bordeglio. But his greatest joy came when someone left behind a fragment of pure white Carrara. As a child, he had stood before the marble cutters, hungering to get his hands on this precious stone. It had never been possible. White marble was rare and costly. Only enough was brought in from Carrara and Seravezza to fulfill commissions. Now, surreptitiously, he began to experiment with the point, the tooth, and flat chisels, working surface textures on the marble as he had on the Pietra Serena at the Topolino's. It was the finest hour of the day for him, alone in the garden, with only the statues for company. Soon, he must have these tools in his hand for good. He must be able to pick them up first thing in the morning, because they were his natural appendages. like arms and legs. He always remembered, when dark fell, to chisel off the contours he had worked so no one would know, to clear away his chips, throwing them into the stone pile in the far end of the garden. Inevitably, he was caught, but by the last person he would have expected to surprise him. Contessina de' Medici came to the garden nearly every day now, if not with Lorenzo, then with Poliziano, or Ficino, or Picco dello Mirandolo, her father's Platonic scholars. She spoke with Granacci, with Sansovino, and Rustici, whom she apparently had known a long time, but no one introduced Michelangelo. She never spoke to him. He knew instantly, without catching sight of the quick-moving figure, or the face that was all eyes, when she entered the gate. He felt the heightened consciousness, as though all movement around him, even of the sun and air, had been speeded up. It was Contessina who freed Granacci from the drudgery of stone. He spoke to her of his feelings. She told her father. One day Lorenzo came into the garden and said, "Granacci, I'd like a big panel, a triumph of Paul Emilius. Would you undertake to paint it?" "Would I?" When need is highest, help is nighest. When Lorenzo turned aside, Granacci pressed his left hand to his lips and fluttered the fingers to Contessina in gratitude. She never paused to look at Michelangelo's work. Always she stopped at Torrigiani's table, standing at the far side of the desk, so that she was facing Michelangelo, and he could see her every gesture, hear her laughter as Torrigiani amused her. Though he watched, fascinated, their eyes never met. When at length she left, he found himself emotionally exhausted. He could not understand this. He cared nothing for girls. Not even a year of Jacopo's tutelage had led him to discern which were mattressable. There were no girls in his family, none in their small circle of friends. He could hardly remember having talked to one. He had never even wanted to sketch one. They were alien to him. Then why was it painful when he saw her laughing in comradeship with Torrigiani, only a few feet away? Why did he become furious with Torrigiani and with her? What could she mean to him, this princess of the noble Medici blood? It was a kind of mysterious malady. He wished she would stay away from the garden, leave him in peace. Rustici said she seldom used to come. Why now, every day, staying for an hour or more? The more passionately he threw himself at the blank pages, the more conscious he was of her standing, shivering at Torrigiani's workbench, flirting with the beautiful muscular athlete, while somehow seeing and absorbing his own every stroke of the charcoal like a personal affront. It was a long time, deep into the heat of summer, with the wildflowers dead and the garden meadows burned down, before he realized that he was jealous. Jealous of Torrigiani, jealous of Contessina, jealous of the two of them together, jealous of each of them separately apart. And he was appalled. And now she had discovered him in the garden after the others had left. She was with her brother, Giovanni, the fat one with the cast in his eye, about his own age, 14. Michelangelo, the illegitimate son of Lorenzo's beloved brother. No, 14. Michelangelo would have guessed, already a cardinal-elect, and her cousin, the illegitimate son of Lorenzo's beloved brother, Giuliano, stabbed to death in the Duomo, by Pazzi conspirators. Michelangelo had been only 3 at the time, but Florentines still talked of the sight of the conspirators hanging from the windows of the Signoria. The first words slipped out unannounced. Buonasera. Buonasera, Michelangelo. Contessina. Come va? This is Contessina. Non sia male. Like a Settignano stonemason, he had been carving a herringbone pattern on a piece of pietra serena. He did not stop working. The stone has a smell of freshly picked figs. And this? She pointed to a piece of marble on the bench beside him. Does it smell of freshly picked plums? No, it has hardly any. He chipped a piece. Here, smell for yourself. She crinkled her nose, laughing at him. He set himself before the marble, began raining blows with the chisel that sent the chips flying. Why do you work so furiously? Doesn't it exhaust you? It would me. He knew of her frailty, the consumption in her family, that had taken her mother and sister within the past year. That was why Lorenzo was so devoted to her, Rustici said, because she was not long for this world. No, cutting stone does not take strength out of you. It puts it back in. Here, try. Working this white marble. You'll be amazed at how alive it comes under your hands. Under your hands, Michelangelo. Will you finish that design on the Pietro Serena for me? But it is nothing, just herringbones, such as we carve for garden walks or cistern covers. I like it. Then I will finish. She stood still, just above him, as he crouched over the stone. When he came to a hard spot, he looked around for a bucket of water, saw none, spat precisely on the area he wanted to soften, then continued the sweep of the chisel over the stone. Amused, she asked. What do you do when you run dry? He gazed up at her, his face flushed. No good Scalpellino ever ran out of spit. With the first intense, locked-in heat of the garden came the first casualty, Soji. His enthusiasm had been withering, like the grass of the meadow. He had won no prizes or commissions, and although Bartoldo had been paying him a few coins, his earnings were higher only than Michelangelo's, which were non-existent. For this reason, Soji thought that Michelangelo might join with him. One breathless evening, late in August, he waited until everyone had left, then flung down his tools and came to the newest apprentice. Michelangelo, let's you and I get out of here. All this stuff is so impractical. Let's save ourselves while there is still time. Save ourselves, Soji? From what? Look, don't be blind. They're never going to give us any commissions or money. Who really needs sculpture in order to live? I do. The emotions of disgust, renunciation, and even fear carved on Soji's face were more eloquent than anything the lad had been able to work into his wax or clay models. Where are we going to find work if Lorenzo should die? But he's a young man, only 40. Then we would have no more patron, no more garden. Are we to wander about Italy like beggars with hats in our hands? Do you need a marble cutter? Could you use a Madonna, a Pietà? I can make you one, if only you'll give me a roof and victuals. Saji swept his few personal possessions into a bag. Mache. I want to be in a trade where folks come to me every day for pasta or pork, for wine or calzone. People can't live without these things. Every day they must buy, so every day I must sell. On what I sell, I will live. I have a practical nature. I have to know that each day I will earn so many soldi. Sculpture is the last of the luxuries, on the very bottom of the list. I want to trade in something on top of the list. What do you say, Michelangelo? They haven't paid you a single scudo. Look how ragged your clothes are. Do you want to live like a pauper all your life? Quit now with me. We'll find jobs together. Soji's outburst was deeply felt. It had been building up for weeks, perhaps months. Yet at the back of his mind, Michelangelo was a little amused. Sculpture is at the top of my list, Soji. In fact, there is no list. I see sculpture, and I'm finished. Finished is right, agreed Soji. My father knows a butcher on the Ponto Vecchio who is looking for help. The chisel, it's just like a knife. The next morning, when Bertoldo heard of Soji's departure, he shrugged. The casualties of sculpture. Everyone is born with a little talent, but with most people, how quickly the flame flickers out. He ran a hand, resigningly, through his thin white hair. We always had this in the studios. You start out knowing that a certain amount of teaching will be wasted. But you can't withhold for that reason, or all your apprentices will suffer. These, Soji, their prompting is not love or affinity for sculpture, but the exuberance of youth. As soon as the first flash begins to fade, they say to themselves, "Stop dreaming. Look for a reliable way of life." When you are the master of a bottega, you will find this to be true. Sculpture is hard, brutal labor. One should not become an artist because he can, but because he must. It is only for those who would be miserable without it. The next morning, moon-faced, Bugiardini, no taller but plumper, arrived as the new apprentice for the garden. Michelangelo and Granacci embraced him warmly. Granacci, having completed his painting for Lorenzo, had shown so much talent at organization that Lorenzo had asked him to become the manager of the garden. He enjoyed being an executive, spending his days making sure that the proper stone, iron, or bronze arrived, setting up contests for the apprentices, getting modest commissions from the guilds. "Granacci, you mustn't," protested Michelangelo. "You have as much talent as anybody in this garden." "But I enjoy it," replied Granacci mildly. "Then stop enjoying it. If we need charcoal or a model, let us get them for ourselves. Why should you give up your work to help us get ours done?" Granacci was not insensible to the compliment embedded in Michelangelo's fury. "There's time for everything, caro mio," he replied. "I have painted, I will paint again." But when Granacci returned to painting, Michelangelo was angrier than ever, for Lorenzo had pressed him into service to design stage settings for a morality play, banners and arches for a pageant. "Granacci, idiota, how can you stand here singing so happily, painting carnival decorations that will be thrown out the day after the pageant?" "But I like doing what you call trivia. Everything doesn't have to be profound and eternal. A pageant or a party are important because people get pleasure from them, and pleasure is one of the most important things in life, as important as food or drink or art." You You Florentine! 6. As the days of fall deepened, so did Michelangelo's friendship. On feast days or church holidays, when the garden was locked tight, Rustici invited him for dinner, then took him through the countryside looking for horses, paying farmers, stablemen, grooms for the privilege of drawing in their barns and fields. "Horses are the most beautiful of God's creatures," exclaimed Rustici. "You must draw them over and over again, every horse you can find." "But, Rustici, I never intend to sculpture a horse, only men. Once you know a horse, you know the world." Sansovino, the contadino from Arezzo, twice Michelangelo's age, had his own philosophy. An artist must return frequently to the soil. He must plow it, sow it, weed it, harvest the grain. The contact with the earth renews us. To be only an artist is to feed on oneself, and go barren. That is why I ride my mule home to Arezzo every few weeks. You must come with me, Michelangelo, and feel the tilled earth under your feet. "I'd like to visit Arezzo with you, Sansovino, if there's any marble I can plow a furrow through." It was only at home that he was unhappy. Ludovico had managed to keep a rough check on how much each of the apprentices at the garden was receiving of prize money, awards, and commissions. He knew that Sansovino, Torrigiani, and Granacci were earning good sums. "But not you?" Ludovico demanded. "Not one single scudo?" "Not yet." "After a full 8 months, why? Why the others and not you?" "I don't know." "I can only come to one conclusion, that you can't compete with the others." "I have not." "Wouldn't Lorenzo know if you had any talent as a sculptor?" "Undoubtedly." "But he has never noticed you?" "Never." "Allora, I'll give you another 4 months to make it a full year. Then if Lorenzo still thinks you're dry fruit, you'll go to work." But Ludovico's patience lasted only 4 weeks. He cornered Michelangelo in his bedroom of a Sunday morning. "Does Bertoldo praise your work?" "No." "Does he say you have talent?" "No." "He gives you no encouragement?" "He gives me instruction." "It is not the same thing." "Ammesso, admitted." "Does he praise the others?" "Sometimes." "Could it be you have the least promise?" "It could not be." "Why not?" "I draw better than they." "Draw? What does that mean? If they are training you to be a sculptor, why don't you sculpture?" "Bertoldo won't let me." "Why not?" "He says I'm not ready." "But the others sculpture?" "Yes." "Can't you see what that means?" "No." "It means that you have less ability than they. That will be proved when I get my hands on stone." "When will that be?" "I don't know." "Until you work the stone, you can earn no return." "No." "And they show no sign of letting you start on the stone?" "None." "Doesn't it look hopeless to you?" "No." "Then how does it look?" "Puzzling." "And how long can you remain there puzzled?" "As long as Bertoldo thinks I should." "What has happened to your pride?" "Nothing." "The same as has happened to you in the garden. Nothing." "One does not lose pride while learning." "You are almost 15 now. Are you to earn nothing forever?" "I will earn." "When? How?" "I don't know." 2 dozen times you have said no, or I don't know. When will you know?" "I don't know." Exhausted, Ludovico cried, "I should beat you with a stick. When will you get some sense in your head? I'm doing what I must."
that is sense. Ludovico slumped into a chair. Leonardo wants to become a monk. Whoever heard of a Buonarroti, a monk? You want to become an artist. Whoever heard of a Buonarroti, an artist? Giovanna Simone wants to become a street rowdy, stoning passers-by. Whoever heard of a Buonarroti as a malandrino? Urbino has sent Sigismondo back saying, I am wasting my money. He cannot learn his letters. Whoever heard of a Buonarroti as illiterate? I don't know any more what a man has sons for. Michelangelo walked over to Ludovico's chair and put a finger lightly on his father's shoulder. Trust me, father. I am not looking for wool on an ass. Affairs grew no better for him at the garden. They seemed indeed to become worse. Bertoldo was pushing him hard, never pleased with anything he did, jumping from one foot to the other, crying, No, no, you can do it better, again, making him redraw models from a ladder above them, the floor beneath, and at the end of the week, obliging him to come in on a holiday to create a theme that would embrace all the figures he had sketched during the week. Walking home with Granacci at night, Michelangelo cried in anguish. Why am I discriminated against? You're not, replied Granacci. But anyone can see it. I'm not permitted to enter any of the competitions for Lorenzo's prize money or work on any of the commissions. I'm not permitted to visit the palace and see the artworks. You're manager of the garden now. Speak to Bertoldo. Help me. When Bertoldo considers you ready to enter contests, he'll say so. Until then, oh Dio, swore Michelangelo under his breath. Until then, I'll be sleeping in the Loggia della Signora, where my father can't get me with a stick. There was something else he was unhappy about, but could not mention to Granacci. With the wet weather, Lorenzo had forbidden Contessina to leave the palace. To Michelangelo, she did not seem frail. He felt a flame in her, a flame strong enough to consume death. Now that she no longer came, the garden seemed strangely empty, the days long and unbroken, without the excitement of waiting. In his loneliness, he turned to Torrigiani. They became inseparable. Michelangelo raved about Torrigiano, of his wit, his flair, his physique. Granacci raised an eyebrow. Michelangelo, I am in a difficult position. I can't say too much without appearing jealous and hurt, but I must warn you, Torrigiani has done this before.
Done what? Lavished his affection, won someone over completely, only to fly into a rage and break off the relationship when there is someone new to romance. Torrigiani needs an audience. You are providing him with that audience. Do not confuse this use with loving you. Bertoldo was not so gentle. When he saw a drawing of Michelangelo's in which he had imitated one of Torrigiani had just completed, he tore it into 100 shreds. Walk with a cripple for a year, and at the end you will limp. Move your desk back where it belongs. Seven. Bertoldo knew that Michelangelo had reached the boundary of patience. He put an arm as brittle as an autumnal leaf about the boy's shoulder. And so, on to sculpture. Michelangelo buried his head in his hands. His amber-colored eyes were intense with feeling. Sweat broke out on his forehead. Relief, joy, misery were mixed together, making his heart pound and hands
tremble. "Now what is sculpture?" demanded Bartoldo, in a mentor's tone. "It is the art which, by removing all that is superfluous from the material under treatment, reduces it to that form designed in the artist's mind." "With hammer and chisel?" exclaimed Michelangelo, recovering his calm. "Or by successive additions," persisted Bartoldo, "as in modeling in clay or wax, which is by the method of putting on." Michelangelo shook his head vigorously. "Not for me. I want to work directly on the marble. I want to work as the Greeks did, carving straight from the stone." Bartoldo smiled wryly. "A noble ambition. But it takes a long time for an Italian to reach back to the Greeks. First, you must learn to model in clay and wax. Not until you have mastered the putting on method can you dare the method of removing." "No stone?" "No stone. Your wax models should be about a foot high. I had Granacci buy a supply of wax for you. To render it supple, we use a little of the animal fat. So, if on the other hand you need more tenacity, you add turpentine." "Va bene." While the wax was melting, Bertoldo showed him how to make an armature using sticks of wood or iron wires, and after the wax had cooled, how to make it into rolls. Once the framework was up, Michelangelo started applying the wax to see how close he could come to creating a three-dimensional figure from a two-dimensional drawing. This, then, was the miracle he had cried about on the steps of the Duomo. For this he had argued the virtues of sculpture over painting. The real task of the sculptor, depth, the round, the dimension, that the painter could only suggest by the illusion of perspective. His was the harsh world of reality. No one could walk around his drawing, but anyone could walk around his sculpture and judge it from every side. And so it must be perfect, not only from the front, but from every angle, said Bertoldo, which means that every piece has to be sculptured not once, but 360 times, because at each change of degree, it becomes a different piece. Michelangelo was fascinated. Bertoldo's voice swept through him like a flame. "Capisco!" "I understand." He took the wax, felt the warmth against his palms. For hands hungry for stone, the roll of wax could not be pleasant. But Bartoldo's words gave him impetus to see if he could build a head, torso, full figure that in some measure captured the drawing. It was not easy. But the sooner began, he cried, the sooner ended. After he had massed his wax on the skeletal frame, he followed Bertoldo's orders to work it with tools of iron and bone. After achieving the roughest approximation, he refined it with his strong fingers. The results had a touch of verisimilitude, some raw power. "But no grace whatever," criticized Bertoldo, "and not the slightest facial resemblance." "I'm not doing portraiture," growled Michelangelo, who absorbed instruction like a dehydrated sponge thrown into an Arno, but bridled at criticism. "You will." "May I speak plainly?" "Have you any other way?" "The devil with portraiture! I never will like it." "Never is longer than your age, than mine. When you're hungry and the Duke of Milan asked you to do his portrait in a bronze medallion..." Michelangelo glowered. "I don't get that hungry." Bertoldo held his ground. He talked of expression and grace and balance, of the interrelation of the body to the head. If the figure had the face of an old man, it had to have the arms, body, legs, hands, and feet of an old man. If it had the face of a youth, it had, in like manner, to be round, soft, and sweet in the expression. The flow of the drapery had to be turned so it suggested a young nude beneath. The hair and beard had to be worked with delicacy. Baccio was the leaven. On those days when Torrigiani had the vapors and sulks, or Sansovino was suddenly homesick for Arezzo, or Michelangelo cried to move ahead to clay, when Bertoldo reproved Rustici for drawing horses while sketching from a male model, when Granacci developed a splitting headache from the constant noise of hammer on chisel, when Bertoldo, racked with cough, moaned that he could have saved himself a lot of trouble by dying from his last attack, this was the moment that Baccio rushed to the rescue, bringing with him the humor of the wine shops and brothels. "Maestro, did you hear about the merchant who complained of his wife's expensive dress? Every time I go to bed with you it costs me a golden scudo." "If you went to bed with me more often," replied the young wife tartly, "it would cost you only a penny each time." "No, I don't keep him on as the garden clown," exclaimed Bertoldo. "He has a promise of talent, and is never unperceptive. Baccio, as much as anyone in this garden, has the will to dedication. He doesn't like to study, he's absorbed by pleasure. But he'll wear these things out. His brother, the Dominican monk, is dedicated to purity. Perhaps that's why Baccio is devoted to lasciviousness. His brother, the Dominican monk, is dedicated to purity. Perhaps that's why Baccio is devoted to lasciviousness." The weeks passed. Bertoldo insisted that Michelangelo perfect himself in the transcription from charcoal to wax. When Michelangelo could stand no more, he threw down his bone tools, walked to the far end of the garden, picked up hammer and chisel, and worked out his fury cutting building blocks for Lorenzo's library. The foreman, not sure he should permit this uprising, asks the first time, "Why do you come to us?" "I must wear this wax off my fingers." "Where did you learn to chip stone?" "In Settignano." "Ah!" Each day, for an hour or two, he worked with the scalpellini. The Pietra Serena blocks between his legs and under his hand lent him durity. Bertoldo capitulated. "Alla guerra de amor vincici fuga," he said. In a love fight, he who flees is the winner. We will go on to clay. Remember that clay worked in a damp state shrinks. Build up your clay bit by bit. Mix in soft cuttings and horsehair to make sure your large models don't split. To clothe your figure, wet a drapery cloth to the consistency of thick mud. Then arrange it around your figure in folds. Later, you'll learn how to expand the model into the size you intend to carve. "You've used the word," grinned Michelangelo. "I must be getting closer." February closed in, with fogs down from the mountains and rain enveloping the walled city until every street became a river. There were few hours of grey light to work by. The churches and palaces were too damp to visit for copying. They were confined to the inner rooms of the casino, with each apprentice sitting on a high stool over a brazier of hot coals. Bertoldo was forced to remain in bed for days at a time. The wet clay seemed clammier and colder than ever. Frequently Michelangelo worked by oil light, frequently alone in the icy casino, not happy, but more content to be here than anywhere else. April was only a couple of months away, and so was Ludovico's decision to take him out of the garden if he had not reached some paid capacity. Bertoldo, when he came wrapped in heavy robes, was a pale wraith, but Michelangelo knew that he must speak. He showed Bertoldo the clay figures he had been modeling, asked permission to copy them in stone. "No, figlio mio," croaked Bertoldo hoarsely. "You are not ready. The others are. I am not. You have much to learn. Admit it." "Pazienzo!" exclaimed Granacci. "God shapes the back to the burden." 8. There were several thorns festering. Bertoldo drove him the hardest, accompanied by a constant stream of criticism. Try as he might, Michelangelo could earn no word of praise. Another sore spot was that he still had not been invited to the palace. Bertoldo would cry, "No, no, this modeling is over-caressed. When you see the sculpture in the palace, you will understand that marble wants to express only the most intense and profound of sentiments." Michelangelo thought, "Well then, invite me, and I will see." When Lorenzo invited Bugiardini to the palace, Michelangelo grew angry. At whom, Bertoldo? Lorenzo? Himself? He could not tell. The exclusion implied rejection. He felt like the ass who carries gold and eats thistles. Then, on a cold but sharply bright end of March day, Bertoldo stood over a clay model Michelangelo had just completed from studies of ancient demigods. Half human, half animal. "There's a newly discovered faun at the palace," said Bertoldo. "We unpacked it last night. Pagan Greek, beyond doubt. Ficino and Landino think about the 5th century before Christ. You must see it." Michelangelo held his breath. "Right now would be the best time. Come along." They crossed the Piazza San Marco and turned down the Via Larga. Bertoldo raised one layer of the heavy wool scarf wound double around his neck, placed it across the lower half of his face to protect his mouth from the piercing cold. On the Via de' Gori side of Medici Palace, had used the wall of the second city limit as a foundation. The architect, Macalozzo, had completed it 30 years before Cosimo. It was large enough to house a numerous family of 3 generations, the government of a republic, the management of a worldwide business, a center for artists and scholars who traveled to Florence, a combined home, office, shop, university, bottega, art gallery, theater, and library, austere with a majestic simplicity that characterized the taste of the Medici. "There is no bad art in the palace," said Bertoldo. The stonework thrilled Michelangelo as he paused on the Via Larga for a moment to gaze in admiration. Though he had seen the palace 100 times, it always seemed fresh and new. What superb craftsmen these Scalpolini were! Each rough, protruding block of the rustic ground floor was chiseled with the authority of a piece of sculpture, the surface resourcefully textured by the calcagnolo, the edges beveled with a lyrical curve out of mass that made the huge blocks sing, and no 2 stones any more duplicates than 2 marble statues by Donatello. Inserted in the heavy blocks was a row of iron rings, to which visitors' horses were fastened. At the corners were large bronze holders in which the night torches were placed. Around the palace, on both streets, ran a high stone bench on which the convivial Florentines could chat and sun themselves. "Each stone of the rustic is so good," said Michelangelo, breaking the silence, "it could be set up on a pedestal and placed in the loggia." "Perhaps," agreed Bertoldo, "but for me too ponderous. They make a building look too much like a fort. I prefer those flat, regular stone panels of the second floor, and even better the miniature stones of the third floor, each carved like a gem. That's what makes the palace grow lighter as it rises in space." "I have never realized," said Michelangelo, "architecture is almost as great an art as sculpture." Bartoldo smiled indulgently. Giuliano di Sangallo, the finest architect in Tuscany, would tell you that the architecture is sculpture, the designing of forms to occupy space. If the architect is not a sculptor, all he gets is enclosed walls. If you need work, you will design a palace instead of a pietà. The corner of the Via Larga and Via de' Gori was an open loggia, which the Medici family used for their feasts and festivities, considered as entertainments by the Florentines, who insisted on seeing what was going on. The loggia had magnificent 30-foot arches carved out of pietra forte, strong stone. It was here that citizens, merchants, and politicos came to confer with Lorenzo, artists and students to discuss their projects. For all there was a glass of sweet white Greco wine, the perfect drink for gentlemen, and a cake of welcome. They entered through the massive gate and came into the square courtyard with its 3 complete arches on each side, held up by 12 heroic columns with decorated capitals. Bertoldo pointed proudly to a series of 8 sculptured classical figures between the tops of the arches and the window sills. "They're mine. I copied them from antique gems. You'll see the originals in Lorenzo's collection in the studiolo. They're so good people mistake them for Donatello's." Michelangelo frowned. How could Bertoldo be content to run so far behind his master? Then his eye moved to 2 of the great sculptures of the city, the Davids of Donatello and the Verrocchio. He rushed with a cry of joy to touch the pieces. Bertoldo came to stand by him, running his practiced hand over the magnificent bronze surfaces. "I helped cast this piece for Cosimo. I was intended to stand right here, in this courtyard, to be looked at from every side. How excited we were! For centuries we had had only the relief, our figures attached to their background. This was the first isolated bronze to be cast in more than 1,000 years. Before Donatello, sculpture was used to ornament architecture in niches, doors, choir stalls, and pulpits. Donato was the first sculptor in the round since the Romans." Michelangelo gazed open-mouthed at Donatello's David, so young and soft, with long curls of hair and high-nippled breast, the slender arm holding a gigantic sword, the left leg carved so gracefully to put the open-sandaled foot on Goliath's decapitated head. It was a double miracle. Michelangelo thought that the bronze casting had come out with such a satin-smooth perfection. For this he knew Bertoldo shared the credit, and that so delicate a figure, almost as slight as Contessina, could have killed Goliath. He had only another moment to study 3 Roman sarcophagi. under the arches, and 2 restored statues of Marsyas. Before Bertoldo started up the great staircase to the chapel above, with its Gonzoli frescoes, so brilliant in color that Michelangelo cried out in astonishment. Then as Bertoldo led him from room to room, his head began to spin, for here was a veritable forest of sculptures and gallery of paintings. He did not have enough eyes in his head or strength in his legs to move from piece to piece or to carry his emotional excitement. No good Italian artist since Giotto or Niccolò Pisano was unrepresented. Marbles by Donatello and Desiderio, de Settignano, by Luca del Robbia and Verrocchio, bronzes by Bertoldo. Paintings hung in every atrium, hallway, salon, family room, office, bedroom. Masaccio's St. Paul, Piazza del Signoria. Paola Uccello's Battle of San Romano, Fight of Dragons and Lions, Giotto's Crucifixion on a wooden table, Fra Angelico's Madonna, Adoration of the Magi, Botticelli's Birth of Venus, Spring Madonna of the Magnificent. There were Castagno's, Filippo Lippi's, Polliero's, and 100 others from Venice and Bruges. They reached Lorenzo's studiolo, the last of a suite of beautiful rooms on what was called the noble floor of the palace. Not Lorenzo's offices, but his small writing room, its vault sculptured by Luca della Robbia. Lorenzo's desk against the back wall, under the shelves that held his treasures, jewels, cameos, small marble bas-reliefs, ancient illuminated manuscripts, a cozy, crowded room intended more for pleasure than work, with small painted tables by Giotto and Van Eyck, antique bronzes, and nude Hercules above the fireplaces. Small bronze heads on the lintels above the doors, glass vases designed by Ghirlandaio. "What do you think?" Bertoldo demanded. "Nothing. Everything. My brain is paralyzed." "I'm not surprised. Here is the faun that arrived from Asia Minor yesterday. His eyes are telling you how much he has reveled in the carnal joys. Must have been the first Florentine. Now I will leave you for a few minutes while I get something from my room." Michelangelo went close to the faun. He found himself looking into gleaming, gloating eyes. The long beard was stained as though red wine had been spilled in merriment. It seemed so intensely alive that Michelangelo felt it was about to speak, yet inside the wicked smile the lips and teeth were no longer visible. He ran his fingertips over the gaping hole, searching for the carving, but it was gone. He threw back his head and laughed, the stone room echoing the sound. The blood had begun to circulate again in his veins. "Have you lost your mouth by boasting of your droll adventures?" he cried out to the faun. Then he took drawing paper and red crayon from inside his shirt, sat at the far side of the room, and sketched the faun, giving it lips, teeth, and an impudent tongue, as he imagined they would have appeared when the Greek sculptor carved them 2,000 years before. He felt someone at his shoulder, then a faint perfume came to his nostrils. He whirled about abruptly. Many weeks had passed since he had seen her. She was so slight, a little body, displacing such a modest amount of space. Her eyes were omnivorous, consuming the rest of her pale, sensitive features by dissolving them in the warm brown liquid of her pupils. She was dressed in a blue gamura, trimmed in brown fur. White stars were appliqued on shirt and sleeves. In her hand was a Greek parchment copy of Isocrates' Orations. He sat motionless, consumed, like herself, in her eyes. Michelangelo, how could there be so much joy from this mere pronouncing of a name which one heard all day without emotion? Contessina, I was studying in my room. Then I knew someone was here. I did not dare hope I would see you. Bertoldo brought me to see the art. Father won't let me come with him to the garden until spring. You do not think I will die? You will live to bear many sons. Color flooded her cheeks. I have not offended you? He asked apologetically. She shook her head. They told me you were blunt. She took a step or two closer to his chair. When I am near you, I feel strong. Why? When I am near you, I feel confused. Why? She laughed, a gay, light sound. I miss the garden. The garden misses you. I should not have thought it noticed. It noticed. She turned from the intensity in his voice. Your work, it goes well? Non sia male. You're not very communicative. I do not aspire to be a talker. Then you should mask your eyes. What do they say? Things that please me. Then tell me. I carry no mirror. What we know of others is our personal secret. He felt exposed, humiliated, for showing any emotion which he could not name. He picked up his sketching paper. I must work now. She stamped her foot. One does not dismiss a Medici. Anger flared into her eyes, darkening their translucence to opaque. Then a tiny smile moved in. You will not hear such stupid words from me again. Non importa. I have a variety of my own. She put out her hand. It was small, the fingers as fragile as birds in his rough, powerful paw. He knew enough not to squeeze. Then, after an instant, he felt a stirring, a warmth, a robust shaking of his hand in her strong grasp. Addio, Michelangelo. Addio, Contessina. Work well. Grazie mille. She was gone, out the door of her father's study, leaving behind a faint perfume in his nostrils, a forging of the blood in his hand, as though he had been working with a perfectly balanced Swedish iron chisel. He applied the red crayon to the paper. (9) That night he tossed and turned sleepless. His first year in the garden was almost up. Suppose that Ludovico should go to Lorenzo, as he had threatened, and demand that his son be released. Would Lorenzo be willing to antagonize a good Florentine family for an apprentice whom he had never even noticed? Yet he simply could not go away without once having got his hands on a piece of stone. He could stand the empty-handed hunger no longer. He leaped out of bed, hurtled into his clothes in the moonlight, bent on reaching Settignano by dawn, and spending the day cutting Pietro Sereno blocks and columns. But when he had run noiselessly down the circular staircase to the Via dei Benticorde, he stopped short. Into his mind there flashed the picture of himself working with the scalpellini at the rear of the garden, where all stones were stored. He saw one in particular, a modest-sized piece of white marble, lying in the grass a short distance from the building blocks. It came to his mind that this block was exactly the right size for the piece of sculpture he envisioned, a faun, like the one in Lorenzo's studiolo, but his own. Instead of turning to his left and following the street of the ditch toward the open country, he turned to his right, walked the Via dei Benci, with its handsome sleeping Bardi palaces, to the high wooden gate in the city wall, identified himself to a guard, crossed the Ponte alle Grazie, and climbed up to the ruins of the Belvedere fort, and sat on a parapet with the shimmering Arno at his feet. Florence, luminous in the full moonlight, so close that he felt he could touch the Signora or Duomo with his fingers, was a sight of such incredible beauty that he drew in his breath sharply. No wonder the young men of the city sang their romantic ballads to their town, with whom no girl could compete. All true Florentines said, "I will not live out of the sight of the Duomo." For him the city was a compact mass of pietra sereno, the streets cut through with a mason's chisel, looking like dark rivers, the cobbled piazzas gleaming white in the moonlight. The palaces stood sentinel, a couple of ranges higher than the modest houses, clustered so tightly about him, the creamy gold sky, the spires of Santa Croce, Santa Maria Novella, the magnificent 300-foot thrust of the Signoria. Making a little group of its own were the great red dome of the cathedral, the glistening small white dome of the baptistery, the noble flesh pink of the campanelli. Around all was the turreted, tower-studded city wall. And sitting there, above his beloved city, he knew what he must do. The moon was beginning to sink beyond the hills. The last of the mist of luminous gray powder settled down on the housetops and was absorbed. Light subtly suggested itself in the east, then flared as though the sun had been hovering jealously below the horizon, waiting only a signal to precipitate itself upon the stage of the Arno Valley, and wrote the magical, mystical moonlight with fierce proof of its own greater power to light, to heat, to make everything known. Cocks began to crow. In the farms upriver, bordering the marsh lake, the guards at the gate gave the cries to open the heavy barred doors. He made his way down the hill, walked along the river to the Ponte Vecchio, the bridge with its meat stalls just being opened by sleepy apprentices, and continued down the Piazza San Marco and the garden. He went directly to the marble block in the grass beyond the new building site, picked it up in his arms, and struggled under its weight down the path to the rear. Here he righted a sawed tree trunk, set the marble block securely upon it. He knew he had no right to touch this marble, that at least, by implication, he had rebelled against the authority of the garden, overthrown Bertoldo's iron-edged discipline. Well, he was on his way out anyway, if his father had his say, and if Bertoldo was going to sack him, let it be done in front of a piece of sculpture for which he had been brought here in the first place. His hands caressed the stone, searched out its more intimate contours. During the entire year, he had never once touched a block of white statuary marble. Why, he asked himself, trembling, do I feel this way? For him the milky white marble was a living, breathing substance that felt, sensed, judged. He could not permit himself to be found wanting. It was not fear, but reverence. In the back of his mind, a voice said, "This is love." He was not frightened or even startled. He recognized it for the simple truth. It was his primary need that his love be reciprocated. Marble was the hero of his life and his fate. Not until this very moment, with his hand tenderly, lovingly on the marble, had he come fully alive. For this was what he wanted to be all his life, a white marble sculptor. Nothing more, nothing less. He picked up Torrigiani's tools and set to work without drawing, without wax or clay model, without even charcoal markings on the tough outer skin of the marble. All he had to go on, beyond impulse and instinct, was the clearly etched image of the faun in the palace, mischievous, pleasure-sated, wily wicked, and thoroughly enchanting. He placed his chisel on the block, struck the first blow with his hammer. This is where he belonged. He, the marble, the hammer and chisel were one. Ten. The faun was completed. For 3 nights he had worked behind the casino. For 3 days he had hidden it beneath a wool cloth. Now he carried it to his workbench. Now he was willing for Bertoldo to see it, his own faun, with full sensual lips set off saucy white teeth, insouciant tongue barely peeping through. He was polishing the top of the head with Pietro Ardita and water to grind away the tool markings and white dots, when the apprentices arrived and Lorenzo came down the walk. He stopped in front of the workbench. "Ah, the faun from my studiolo," said Lorenzo. "Yes." "You left out his beard." "I did not feel it necessary." "Isn't the job of copyist to copy?" "The sculptor is not a copyist." "Not even the apprentice?" "No, the student must create something new from something old." "And where does the new come from?" "From where all art comes, inside himself." He thought he saw a flicker in Lorenzo's eye. It was quickly suppressed. "Your faun is old." "Shouldn't he be?" "I wasn't questioning his age. It's just that you left him all his teeth." Michelangelo gazed at his statue. "I was making amends for the other mouth that decayed." "You should have known that there are always some wanting in fellows of his age." "In a man, yes. But in fauns?" He could not resist an impish grin. "Fauns are supposed to be half goat. Do goats lose teeth?" Lorenzo laughed good-naturedly. "I've never looked." When he left, Michelangelo took up his chisel and went to work on the faun's mouth. Lorenzo returned to the garden the next day. Today it was warmer, and Bertoldo was with him. Lorenzo stopped in front of the workbench. "Your faun seems to have matured 20 years in a day. The sculptor is master of time. He can age his subjects, forward or back." Lorenzo seemed pleased. "I see you have removed an upper tooth, and 2 lower ones in the other corner. For balance. You have also closed his gums where the teeth had been." Michelangelo's eyes danced. "It was perceptive of you to rework the entire mouth. Someone else might have been content just to hammer out a few teeth." It followed logically. Lorenzo stared at him for a moment in silence, his deep brown eyes somber. Then he said, "I'm pleased to see that we have not been making soup in a basket." He departed. Michelangelo turned to Bertoldo, who was pale and trembling a little. Bertoldo said nothing. Then he too laughed. The next morning, a page in varicolored stockings and a scarlet coat appeared in the garden. Bertoldo called out, "Michelangelo, you are wanted at the palace. Accompany the page." "You've gotten yourself sacked," exclaimed Baccio, "for stealing that marble." Michelangelo looked at Bertoldo, then Granacci. Their expression told him nothing. He went with the page, entered the rear garden through the old battlemented wall, stared with bulging eyes at the box trees cut into the shape of elephants, stags, ships under full sail. He stopped short in front of a fountain with a granite basin on which stood Donatello's bronze Judith. "If you please, sir," cried the page, "Il Magnifico must not be kept waiting." It took an act of violence to tear his eyes and body away from the powerful yet defeated figure of Holofernes, about to have his head cut off by Judith's upraised sword. The page led him down a wooden carriage ramp to the basement, then up 2 flights of narrow back stairs. Lorenzo was seated behind his desk in the library, a large, shelf-lined room housing the books which his grandfather had begun assembling 50 years before. There were only 2 pieces of sculpture in the room, marble bust of Lorenzo's father and uncle by Mino de Fiesole. Michelangelo walked quickly to the bust of Piero, Lorenzo's father. His face flushed. "See this high polish, as though 1,000 candles were burning within." Lorenzo rose, stood by Michelangelo's side to study the sculpture. That was Mino's special gift. He could make white marble appear like warm flesh. He used a full rounded chisel to shape the hair. But see how gently the chisel penetrated the marble? Michelangelo ran his finger over the flowing waves. "Yet the lines are sharply incised," said Lorenzo. "That's called ferrata, where the tool spontaneously describes a movement of the hair. What the stonemasons call the long drive," added the boy. "Mino was an exquisite," said Lorenzo. "He substituted sentimentality for technique. Yet this bust of my father is the first full marble portrait ever carved in Florence. The first." Then Mino had courage. In the silence that followed, Michelangelo's face suddenly went crimson. He bowed stiffly from the waist. "I did not present my greetings, messieurs. I became excited about the sculpture and began talking." Lorenzo waved this aside. "I forgive you. How old are you, Michelangelo?" 15. "Who is your father?" "Ludovico di Leonardo Buonarrota Simoni." "I have heard the name." He opened his desk, took out a parchment folio. From it he spread out dozens of drawings. Michelangelo could not believe what he saw. "But those are mine." "Just so. Bertoldo told me he destroyed them." Lorenzo leaned over his desk toward him. "We have put many obstacles in your path, Michelangelo. Bertoldo has borne down hard with harsh criticism and little praise or promise of reward. We wanted to make sure you had stamina. We knew you had a real talent, but did not know your character. If you had left us for lack of praise, our money, awards, There was a silence in the beautiful room, permeated with the delicious aromas of parchment pages, leather bindings, and freshly printed sheets. Michelangelo's eyes roamed the walls, seeing titles in a dozen different languages, of which he could make out not a letter. His back teeth had so locked that his tongue had no room to move or speak. Lorenzo came around to the boy's side. Michelangelo, you have the makings of a sculptor. Bertoldo and I are convinced that you could become heir to Orcagna, Ghiberti, Donatello. Michelangelo remained tautly silent. I should like you to come and live in the palace, as a member of my family. From now on you need concern yourself only with sculpture. I like best to work in marble. Lorenzo chuckled. No thanks, no expression of pleasure at coming to live in the palace of Medici, only your feeling for marble. Isn't that why you invited me? Send Ultra. Will you bring your father to me? Tomorrow. What must I call you? What you will. Not Magnifico? Why not? What meaning has a compliment if one hears it night and day from the lips of sycophants? I did not say that. With what name do you think of me? Lorenzo. You speak it with affection. So I feel. Do not in the future ask me what you must do. I have come to expect the unexpected from you. Once again Granacci offered to plead for him with Ludovico. Ludovico could make no sense out of what Granacci was telling him. Granacci, you are leading my son astray. The Medici palace is not really astray, Monsieur Buonarroti. They say it is the finest palace in Europe. But what does it mean, a stonecutter in a fine palace? It is the same as a groom. Michelangelo is not a stonecutter. He is a sculptor. Non importa. Under what terms does he go into the palace? You do not understand, monsieur. He is not to be paid. Not to be paid? Another year of waste. Il Magnifico has asked Michelangelo to come and live in the palace. He will be as a member of the family. He will eat at the table with the great of the world. Who eats with the powerful will have his eyes squirted out with cherry stones. He will learn from the Plato Academy, the finest scholars of Italy, continued Granacci stolidly. And he will have marble to carve. Marble, groaned Ludovico, as though the word were anathema. You cannot refuse to speak to Il Magnifico. I will go, mumbled Ludovico. What else can I do? But I don't like it. Not at all. In the palace, standing before Lorenzo in the studiolo, with Michelangelo at his side, the son found the father humble, almost pathetic, and he felt sorry for him. Buonarroti, Simone, we would like Michelangelo to live with us here and become a sculptor. Everything will be provided for him. Will you concede the boy? Magnifico, Messieurs. I know not how to deny you, replied Ludovico, bowing deeply. Not only Michelangelo, but all of us, with our lives and wits, are at the pleasure of your magnificence. Good. What do you do? I have never followed any craft or trade. I have lived on my meager income, attending to the few possessions left to me by my ancestors. Then make use of me. See if there is in Florence something I can do for you. I will favor your interest to the utmost of my power. Ludovico glanced at his son, then looked away. I know not how to do anything but read and write. The companion of Marco Pucci in the custom house, has just died, and I should be pleased to have his place. The custom house? It pays only 8 scudi a month. It seems to me I could fitly discharge that office. Lorenzo raised both hands to elbow height, shook his fingers as though to rid them of water. I had expected you would request something much grander, but if you desire to become the companion of Bucci, you can do so. He turned back to Michelangelo, standing tight-lipped before him. A warm smile lighted the dark, homely face. It is 60 years since my grandfather, Cosimo, invited Donatello into his home to execute the bronze statue of David.